Okay, welcome everybody to our second session on the 1844 Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. We are going to jump right in from where we left off. Um, where we left off was looking at the opening section of the text up to about page 40. And so what's going on in this section here is a capitulation, right? What I called last time a literature review of the predominant political economists of the time in 1844, including Say, including Sismondi, including Adam Smith, and a bunch of other kind of more minor political economists. Ricardo is also mentioned, and in fact, um, Ricardo is mentioned, and it's so funny because last time we were talking about how Ricardo has this almost like uh more radical critique of capitalism than does Marx in a certain way. Like you can already tell that Ricardo um thinks that in a sense um capital is almost more nihilistic than would Marx. It doesn't seem like there's much that Ricardo finds worth preserving in capitalism. And even also, that's the striking thing, right? Is that even Adam Smith by no means comes across as what conservatives and liberals talk about Adam Smith today as some kind of advocate of the invisible hand or sort of champion of capitalism. That's not the picture that Marx presents of Smith in this opening section. Ricardo sees poverty as caused by the power of things. So therefore, there's an implied theory of alienation that Ricardo has, and Sismondi also agrees there's an implied theory of alienation. We get to the section on page 41 where we're talking about um, landlords, and we are talking about um, rentier capitalists, and we're also talking about the accumulation of capitalism, right? And he says at the bottom of page 41 is that accumulation, when private property prevails, is the concentration of capital in the hands of a few. It is in general an inevitable consequence if capitals are left to follow their natural course, and it is precisely through competition that the way is cleared for this natural destination of capital. And he goes on to show how these accumulation cycles end up eradicating the distinctions that emerged from feudal forms. So he'll go on in a moment to talk about landlords and the function of how feudal landlords are obliterated ultimately, because in capitalism, the accumulation cycles requires for the land basically to become a commodity, and that then cancels out the function of the landlord. And then he says that when the landlord in that feudal structure is abolished through capitalist processes, he says that amongst the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, that actually produces a nostalgia for, and even like a confusion. I'll show you the quote in a moment, um, about this paradoxical freeing moment that capital does. So capitalism breaks from a certain conception of the landlord and the landlord's relationship of the value to the land, right? And this becomes highly destabilizing. And so actually, for Adam Smith recognizes that the origin of the landlord and their rights is actually based in robbery. He says that straight out. The rent of the land is the produce of the land, and it always becomes a monopoly that the landlord sets on price. And that price is determined by the landlord in a monopolistic way based on what the farmer can afford and is able to give. Therefore, the rent of land becomes this struggle between tenant and landlord. And Smith says that However, on page 59, Smith says that this struggle is ultimately a struggle that's in the service of what he calls society. So that is interesting because what that indicates to Marx is a profound contradiction in Smith, which is that Smith has a definition of society which is super half-baked, because ultimately he's basically saying, yeah, this monopoly is in the interest of society. So then what is your definition of society, Smith? This is sort of empty, right? So yeah, so basically we move from 41, 43. Marx introduces the distinction between circulating capital and fixed capital. This is a distinction that reappears later in Marx's Capital. And circulating capital, just as a kind of metric or sort of defining point, is the more dynamic form of capital, which on page 45 which furnishes the materials and wages of labor. It puts industry into motion. Every saving, therefore, is the expense of maintaining fixed capital, and fixed capital is basically like the equipment that allows for the capitalist to ensure that labor can happen. So that distinction is discussed. It's an interesting thing that he does. Why I call it a literature review is if you read from page like 45 all the way through this long block quote, which goes from all the way to 51, right? He's basically quoting in and out different political economists, mostly Adam Smith, right? And making small comments in the margins as he goes along, right? And in essence, what he's trying to put forward is certain laws of political economy, a kind of it's kind of like a dismal science, an incomplete science that he's identifying, and he's pointing to all of these blind spots. Again, Marx does not have a conception of fetishism, which is this notion that he'll develop in Capital, which is that political economy and capitalist economy in particular basically creates sort of covers or veils around social relations. So classes and actors within a capitalist society can't fully see the way that their system is interconnected across these systems, right? And so I found a striking passage on Ricardo on page 48 at the bottom that I'll read out. He says, quote, Ricardo in his book called Rent on Land says, nations are merely production shops. Man is a machine for consuming and producing. Human life itself is a kind of capital, right? Economic laws blindly rule the world. For Ricardo, men are nothing, and the product is everything, right? To an individual with a capital of 20,000 whose profits is 2,000 per annum, it would be a matter quite indifferent whether his capital would employ 100 or 1,000 men. Is not the real interest of the nation similar? So this goes back to my first comment, which is he's reading all these different political economists. They all have a sort of implied radicalism, but without a thought out sort of logic by which this system is problematic. They have no true account for how it is interconnected. And so you can already see the project of capital is in a kind of utero, is in germinal form here. So I don't know if there's any thoughts on at this point, but all of this is sort of to lay out before we get to the section on rent of land. Go ahead, I think, Andrew.
Yeah, it was interesting hearing that layout of like Smith talking about landlords and robbery, and then like the sort of exegeticals that he's giving of like all these other different economists, which is what I was thinking. You use the term like literary review. I think of it as like exegetical, but I mean same I guess. But it seems like what he's pointing out is like they're kind of getting close at something, but then like they gloss over their sort of presuppositions. And it reminds me of what Althusser says in the beginning of what is it, the reproduction of capitalists and ideological state apparatuses, how like he points out Marx says the same thing about Proudhon's notion of society as it being sort of a mystification. And so Marx's notion of social formations or social production is a more materialistic way. So it's like in that same way, he's kind of pointing out those like presuppositions that gloss over their limits. Yeah, and it's like, why is it a robbery? Like for Smith, it's like he's saying that this is a robbery, and yet, like at the same time, the system that's creating that is for society. So not only is it for society and what is society for Adam Smith, but it's like there's a sort of disavow in the logic of Smith.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like a
There's something
disavow.
incomplete. There's something
Yeah.
incomplete. There's a suggestion that something like a concept of alienation is needed, but it's not present.
Mhm.
And of course, the concept of alienation is already developed in Hegel, right?
Mhm.
But it is not touched or has not
Right.
been brought into the field of political economy yet.
Yeah.
So you can see that part of his objective in citing these, um, he's both citing the kind of primitive science of political economy, pointing to the law of accumulation, pointing to the law of competition, pointing to these very helpful categories that he thinks are completely valid to explain capitalism, like fixed and circulating capital, um, you know, um, and pointing to how there is a kind of tripartite class system that ultimately gets dissolved or broken down, and which results in, through the natural processes of capitalism, right, a contestation over two classes,
Right.
which is the broader working class and the capitalist class. And the process by which that happens is revolutionary unto itself, but it also, according to Marx, um, will inevitably pit a revolutionary confrontation. And along the way, I think it's important to note that all of the kind of internal or intra class conflicts that almost set the way or pave the way for the supremacy of the capitalist in some ways, right? And and that's a very interesting theory, because that's a theory that um, that in a lot of ways is very much like exactly the story of how capitalism uh, in our time, as we're most familiar with it, right, um, evolved insofar as capital had this sort of like tidal wave force of tearing apart the welfare state, right, which was won on the backs of large scale egalitarian socialist movements all throughout the 19th century into the 20th century. And then about the 1970s, we see a massive liberal reaction against that, and it's now in a stage of a kind of unhinged capital, right?
Mhm.
So in that sense, that's why like every time capital has these revolutions of accumulation cycles, you can count on Marx's popularity to rise.
Right.
Because it's again, I think, showing a sort of prophetic point of Marx. But the rent of land on 53, we can go through this because my objective really is to push through this section to get to the meat of tonight's engagement, which is on estranged labor. Okay. So, as I mentioned before, um, the rent of land has its origin in robbery. The landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed and demand a rent, even for the natural produce of the earth. And so basically, it's the most criminal uh, enterprise because it's extracting a natural use value, not exchange value, the land, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's determined by the pure force of monopoly of price that the landlord sets on whoever the tenant may be. And So every political economist has to see that. Like in a sense, it's indefensible in a way. And so if capital has a tendency, which Marx will say in a moment, to obliterate that originary feudal structure, right? Um, Perhaps you could say that in a sense, the political economists will see capital's movement of obliterating the old landlord form as somehow liberatory or something like that, even though it's hard to defend that, right? Um, so, anyways, so he says something very significant on this point, which I want to raise with you right now, which is that um, the capitalist comes to dominate because the process of ground rent to interest on money follows that rent must call for more and more so that eventually only the wealthiest can live off of rent. And on page 62, he says this has the consequence that a large part of landed property falls into the hands of the capitalists and the landowners. And this then results in the abolishment um, of the capitalist and the landowner. So there is only two classes, the capitalist and the working class. And then he says at this point on page 62, 63, this movement of accumulation of basically the class war pits the old school landlord against the capitalist class. And the way of capitalist development will have it that the capitalist class will win over the landlord. And the result of that winning over the landlord will produce a reverberation in the culture for a romanticism, you could say, of feudalism. And Marx rejects this romanticism, right? And that's actually an interesting side point, which Marx had this long-standing debate with Ferdinand Lassalle. You may be familiar with this. He was a charismatic socialist and a comrade of Marx. And he said that the working class should side with the old interest of the aristocracy in line with the workers' interests against the capitalists, right? Against that kind of merchant bourgeois class. And Marx actually ends up disagreeing with him on that. So it's another example of the way that Marx, in a certain way, kind of doesn't celebrate this accumulation process and the dispossession that it causes of the landlord, because he's acknowledging that the landlord is a total parasitical figure. But he's also suggesting that revolutionizing capitalism can never involve or entail some kind of nostalgia for a romantic return to it. Um, so I found that quite powerful and interesting. Um, but yeah, it's basically but even before that happens, like the whole concept of rent that Marx develops on 56 and 57 is also very powerful. Um, Rent is to be observed um, as structured on the price of commodities and the high or low wages and profit in the causes of higher low prices. Higher low rent is the effect of this, right? So this is another way that the landlord class is interconnected with the capitalist class, but they don't acknowledge that dependency. But you see why it's a dependency, because um, the worker can only pay the rent based on the wage that is set by the capitalist class. So you see so they're in that's the notion of a missed totality. That's the notion of fetishism. There's no conscious awareness of that. And not only is there no conscious awareness of that, their conflict exists elsewhere because the processes of capitalism are undermining the interests of the landlord. So you see how strange that is, and how even ultra alienating that is for the worker who's screwed by both classes, right? That's pretty I think that's a pretty sound point that he makes there. Um Says on 59, it is absurd to conclude, as Smith does, that since the landlord exploits every benefit which comes to society, the interests of the landlord is always identical with that of society. In the economic system, under the rule of private property, the interest which an individual has in society is in precisely inverse proportion to the interest society has in him, just as the interest of the moneylender in the spendthrift is by no means identical with the interest of the spendthrift. So again, it's that point at which Smith can't see. Uh, Smith, it's not even that he's idealistic. It's worse than that, right? It's worse than that because it's almost like a refusal in some sense. Um, I like to use the example of liberals that refuse to think about Israel Palestine before October 7th. It reminds me of that, right? It's like from where does your blind spot and your refusal come from, right? To see this situation as it is. Uh, um, and then on page
Right.
60, he says,
Oh,
please, please.
oh. It's also I think interesting as an early text to see somewhat the absence of ideology as a as a category. So this idea that one's interest, yeah, is like transparent to them and is that there's no self-deception or any even. So this is what I find interesting, like you're saying about Smith and Ricardo. They're not like capitalism's great. It is the engine for human freedom, which is what neoliberals will say or contemporary libertarians will say. That the very question of freedom is, is best achieved through a kind of capitalism. And so there's also this interesting kind of I don't know if it's in the tension between his just presentation of this like lit review that the question of kind of one's relationship to the mode of production seems a little bit like transparent, or at least just aligned with kind of interest or subsistence.
Great point. There's not really a theory of ideology. The word does not appear in the text, as far as I can see. Okay. Where ideology will appear is a few years later um, in some of Marx's work. But at this point, um, it's not there. So neither is fetishism, right? And so this, I think, is owed perhaps to the theoretical um, and kind of the Feuerbachian paradigm in which Marx is so immersed in. So that might account for it in some sense. But also, as I said before, from a political biographical standpoint, Marx is just beginning his reading, which would be a life's long work in reading political economy. He's only been doing it for about 2-3 years. So he's still quite green in reading this stuff. And so that actually helps us situate the text because we can then retroactively apply the more sophisticated Marx to this text. Because again, like I said at the beginning of the last session, this opening lit review, before we get to the meaty section on estranged labor, which we will get to in just a few minutes, there's a way to sort of read that where you don't have to discard some of his less developed aspects, and that's how I would prefer to read it, frankly. um so yes.
I would just
um
say, and I just think it's interesting to
Please.
think about the idea of blind spots, right? Which in this presentation, it seems to be this inability to connect, right? And I guess in later sort of theories of ideology, it will be more about false consciousness,
Right.
right? So anyway, I'm just
That's
thinking
right.
of big theories. But yes, thanks.
And once we develop um alienation in relationship to um man-to-man alienation, right? Like that particular form of alienation, you will then see why a theory of ideology qua false consciousness and then later commodity fetishism will be necessary. So you can see it's in germinal form here. Okay, well, we will see that. Okay. So here we are in 61. The small landed proprietor working on his own account stands to the big landowner in the same relation as an artisan possessing his own tool to the factory owner. I think that's an important point because that again shows that Marx's theory of class struggle, okay, is one in which classes internal to themselves have these rivalries between large and small interest groups, and that the large capitalist class will inevitably win the day. So that's a kind of recurring motif. Small property and land has become a mere instrument of labor. Rent of land entirely disappears from the small proprietor. There remains to him at the most the interest on his capital and his wages. For ground rent can be driven down by competition till it is nothing more than the interest on capital not invested by the proprietor. So capital eats up the small landowner, right? And that then creates proletarianization amongst that class. It creates splinterings into things like the downwardly mobile phenomenon. That itself creates certain politicization of that class. And so, but again, because Marx is working on a thesis of immiseration, the version of capitalism that Marx is encountering here is a zero-sum game in which we are bottoming out towards a horizon in which a capitalist class will be almost in a position of pure domination, okay? And they will have a showdown between a larger working class. Incidentally, that is not exactly the direction that capitalism took. So that's important to qualify. But nonetheless, we should just, I think we should just bracket that point, and we can say more about that at a later point. And here's what I mean by the romanticism. He says, quote on 63, "We will not join in the sentimental tears wept over this romanticism. Romanticism always confuses the shamefulness of the huckstering of the land with the perfectly rational consequence, inevitable and desirable within the realm of private property, of the huckstering of private property and land." And so he has this really interesting point, which he makes. I'll read this to you very quickly. He says, "The medieval maxim, there is no land without its master, by capitalism is replaced by money knows no master. This means that capitalism turns the land into a commodity. A commodity as a pure exchange value in society, which is what the worker is reduced to, right? Even erodes the land, which is a pure use value as a physical object of pure need and so on, even erodes that into this abstraction. It abstracts it into this exchange value version of it. And then one can see why you have a certain chaotic politics emerge, precisely because everything is forced into this commodified relationship in which authority is kind of vacant. And that's actually an interesting motif of modernity, which is modernity, if we define modernity as Marxists, as the triumph of capitalism. Modernity is also a question about a kind of inevitable horizontalism of authority, right? And so that's always a paradox of capitalism, right? Which is this paradox around its instrumentalization on authority. It's, you could say in a sense, the process of capital accumulation forces the problem of authority to be revealed. It unfixes authority in some ways, which is something to look at in a bigger way. Okay, my friends, so that really brings us to, I think, the conclusion of the opening lit review, quote unquote. And now we are at what I think is the heart of the text, which is the chapter on estranged labor. So if it's okay with folks, we can jump into that. Unless there's any other thoughts before we do. Okay, great. Okay. So
I had
Marx
one.
begins.
I had one just
please,
thought. Hello?
please. Hi.
Oh, just that. Just
Please introduce yourself
what
if you
had
don't
been.
mind.
Oh, sure. I'm Matilda. I missed the first show, but I watched the video of it, and I appreciated that it was recorded. And I live in Oklahoma and have been studying Marx for some time, and I don't work out of an academy or anything. Just trying to escape the menacing society. And it seems like what was necessary about the prior part was that there are only two classes, that Adam Smith was seeing this like three estates kind of like scenario that was false in some way, and that as the bourgeoisie like came to power in the French Revolution or whatever, as the general interest of society, that has been proven false. And I feel like a lot of this prior to alienated labor is to establish that claim that the bourgeoisie is not in the general interest of society, and that the workers and the capitalists don't have the same interest or whatnot.
Yes, that's right. Well said. I think you nailed it. I think you did an excellent job. I don't know if there's a particular question or further comment, but that was excellent. I'd like to start off by reading the opening paragraph because the stakes are very, very clear here. So let me just do that, okay? We have proceeded from the premises of political economy. I'm on page 69, okay? We have accepted political economy's language and its laws. We presuppose private property, the separation of labor, capital and land, and of wages, profit of capital, and rent of land. Likewise, the division of labor, competition, and the concept of exchange value, etc. On the basis of political economy itself, in its own words, the literature review, we have shown that the worker sinks to the level of a commodity and becomes indeed the most wretched of commodities, that the wretchedness of the worker is in inverse proportion to the power and magnitude of his or her production, that the necessary result of competition is the accumulation of capital in a few hands, and thus the restoration of monopoly in a more terrible form, that finally the distinction between capitalist and land rentier, like that between tiller of the soil and the factory worker, disappears, and that the whole of society must fall apart into the two classes, the property owners and the propertyless workers. Okay. It's very important that Marx mentions property. And when we're going to conclude tonight, we're going to return to the problem of property because it is actually the heart of alienation as Marx develops it. Okay. So Marx, in a sense here, is saying that the only wheels which political economy sets in motion are avarice and the war among the avaricious, competition. Political economy does not see the relation between large and small elements within its own sectors. What is the connection between these disconnections in the system of estrangement and the money form is what he asks. So he says, without an idea of fetishism, right? And again, fetishism is the standpoint at which one doesn't see. And we talked before about how Marx is working on an epistemology of knowledge of sight and non-sight, which I think is valid and correct. And so he's going to develop what he means by the money form in a moment, because money becomes the arbiter of this world that capitalism produces of no masters, right? And it's the most insidious form of mastery because it has nothing substantive behind it in some sense. It's completely arbitrary and contingent in a certain way. But ultimately what Marx is leading up to here, as the Feuerbachian Hegelian philosopher that he is at this moment, is the idea that they have no foundation. The political economists have no foundation on which to rest their wider ideas of these laws that we just talked about in the lit review, right? This makes them like modern day theologians.
Right.
Because theology assumes the fall of man by some historical necessity. But we proceed on the basis of an actual economic fact. Now, we don't need to say, oh, well, Marx is reducing everything to some positivism here. We don't need to say that, but he does say on page 71, we proceed from an actual, in italics, economic fact, right? And what is that? Well, it is that there's higher logic of the laws that these thinkers have bequeathed to us. And that is that this system can be seen as a system. Every time, you hear the word totality in Marx, which is a term he really uses later in Capital, you should just simply think of system. And so Marx is a philosopher of the system of capitalism. And these political economists have no sight of the system, okay? The worker becomes an ever cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates. With the increasing value of the world, of things proceeds in direct proportion to the devaluation of the world of men. Labor produces not only commodities, it produces itself and the worker as a commodity, and does so in the proportion in which it produces commodities generally. Okay. So he's already set down his accusation that these thinkers are diagnosing something kind of true and correct, but they're all over the place, and they're also afraid, you could say, of the truths that they've unearthed. Kent, please jump in.
If it's all right, I was just gonna kind of go back to that comparison between political economy and theology. That's like right at the top of page 71.
Please.
And at the end of page 70, about a fictitious primordial condition. And he says, theology in the same way explains the origin of evil by the fall of man. That is, it assumes as a fact in historical form what has to be explained. And I was a little dissatisfied here because I wanted him to like take from the lit review above and say, what are the facts that Smith, say, and others are presupposing, and what is in need of explanation. He kind of, I guess this is still by means of introduction, he's going to get to the relation he thinks that needs to be explained between, I guess, the worker and his livelihood. Maybe somebody else can. There's other hands are raised at this point, but I'd like to sort of figure out what counts as a mistaken fact from the political economist and what is in need of explanation from Marx and from us.
Fair enough. I have thoughts on that, but we can go to Andrew and then Connor.
I thought it was pretty fascinating, just like Kent, about the homology with the presuppositions of political economy and theology, because it seems like their presuppositions are on a sort of like uh myth of origin. And when I think of myth of origin and theology and property, I think of a Locke with the God and property. But what I was kind of wondering, because you brought up like, even though he hasn't developed a theory of fetishism, it seems to me that like when he states in the beginning of this chapter, like we proceed from the premises of political economy, we have accepted its language and its laws, but in further investigation, it seems like what he's doing is exposing that there is a fetishism of presuppositions. And it's like, and maybe I'm kind of imposing into the text from reading Karatani, like a pre-critical metaphysics, a pre-critical epistemology of political economy. And that's where he wants to show that everything is rooted in something of producing commodities, which money has no master. And so it overrides property, but this money sort of correlates with itself as a universal equivalent with commodities and its conditions of possibility, which is the
Yeah.
property owner and the propertyless worker, right?
Yeah, I mean, to Kent's point, I mean, like if Say and Sismondi and Smith all have these implicit theories of Marx's notion of alienation, or not, sorry, not Marx's notion, but of alienation, of what does that mean? That just means like Say already confesses that the worker is reduced to a product, an objectified, there's a problem of objectification. So, but he doesn't call it evil. He doesn't address it, in part because that's an issue, and Bolivar is really good on this, and looking at this text. That's an issue of the interdisciplinarity of the 1844 manuscripts, because what Marx is doing is incorporating like 5 or 6 disciplines back into political economy, because they're you could say like their episteme, like the limits of the knowledge that they're working with, right? Doesn't allow them to address the problem that they've only halfway identified. But then Kent, as it pertains to these laws, I mean, he does list them, right? And he's saying that furthermore, the problem is between these laws of division of labor, of law of competition, of all of these different categories that he talks about, and the estrangement that this has on the worker, and then when he says the money form. So I feel like he does. I do kind of want to defend Mark on that, but let's go to Connor. Perhaps Connor has a response.
Yeah, sure. First of all, what's up, everybody? This question on theology, I see it just as, I don't know if idealism has been mentioned in the text. Maybe I missed that, but this is really an attack on idealism, especially this aspect of like theology. So even on page 70, the very top of page 70, talking about classic political economy, it does not comprehend these laws. It does not demonstrate how they arise from the very nature of private property. Political economy does not disclose the source of the division between labor and capital, and between capital and land, and then it goes on. But the basic idea is that, you know, these laws do not fall out of the sky as if bequeathed to us from God, as Daniel earlier said, but rather result from the activity of man. That's where these laws emerge from. And if Kent was talking about the problem, what is in need of explanation, it's how these laws emerge and why they emerge, right? So
Wonderful. That's very helpful. I'm with you on that, and I think that's well said to connect it to idealism like that,
So
because it's about
I think,
the emergence.
sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, in that same sentence just above, he mentions the formula, the material process. So I think you have a point that he is criticizing idealism in this this sentence. He has the word material process, and then he has kind of these like Hegelian terms of like formula is kind of a term that Hegel might use, or like Marx might think about, like people thinking pre-dialectically about the world. I just found that this passage was very interesting with the use of the word material above, and then the use of the word formula and laws, just kind of triggered kind of the material dialectic in me, and this critique of the idealistic dialect, or the critique of metaphysical idealism, and then like Hegel's kind of dialectical metaphysics, and then Marx's overcoming of that with dialectical materialism.
Just to add on to that, right? Because again, right, it's the right move to emphasize the material processes and so on. But getting ahead a little bit, maybe, but not too far. It's still on page 71. It's so interesting how the first time he mentions alienation in a paragraph, he talks about how the objectification of labor causes the loss of reality for the worker. So in other words, then this, just returning to the material is a problem in itself, right? And if the loss of reality, it's as though the loss of reality compels us to capitulate to idealism, right? So it's not like you can just simply say, let's be materialist, guys, right? It's more complicated than that. So
yeah.
Okay, great.
Theology is that which is not historical, I guess, in a sense.
Okay. All right. So now Marx is going to shift terrain. Okay. And he's sort of done for the time being talking about the pitfalls of the idealist political economists. And he's now going to create a phenomenology of what he calls the objectification of labor as it is experienced by the worker in capitalist society. Okay. And so, objectification is a concept from Hegel as well as from Feuerbach that I think is important to get some familiarity on, because Marx wants to make a kind of series of claims here, right? About how labor becomes a source of objectification through the work of practical activity. And ultimately also, by the way, a much broader and more sweeping claim about what distinguishes man, okay? What distinguishes man as species being, okay, in relationship to culture, okay, as well as to animals, okay? And so, but first, right, Marx is actually starting from the standpoint of alienated labor, okay, and from the standpoint, therefore, of the propertyless worker, okay, and where he's going, just as preparation, because this is big stuff we're getting into here. He's going down that road. He's going down this road of defining the human being, okay, and defining and giving further material foundation, okay, to the absence of that foundation in existing political economy, okay. So that's a little bit of a setup for where we're going, because there's this is a little bit of a steep hill to climb, and so please jump in as I try to sort of guide us along here. So Marx says on 71 that labor produces not only commodities, it also produces itself and the worker as a commodity. That we already saw. And it does this in the proportion in which it produces commodities in general. This fact expresses merely the object which labor produces, labor's product. And this product that labor produces confronts the worker as something alien, as a power independent of the producer. The product of labor is labor which has been congealed in an object which has become material. It is the objectification of labor. Labor's realization is its objectification. Okay? In the conditions dealt with by political economy, this realization of labor appears to the worker as a loss of reality, objectification as loss of object, and as object bondage, appropriation as estrangement, as alienation. Okay? So, in a sense, what we're talking about here is the introduction of a form of objectification which is different than this brutal form of objectification as bondage, right? Which Marx is going to posit and to invent and to think, okay? And then ultimately juxtapose, right? So he's not taking a sort of brutalist idea, right, which would take commodification as that which is somehow a reflection of that which is natural. No, he's saying that this is the most unnatural form of objectification of human labor possible. Okay, so he's rejecting it. Okay. All right. So from there, so much does the appropriation of the object appear as estrangement to the worker, Marx says lower on page 71, that the more objects that the worker produces, the fewer he can possess, and the more he falls under the dominion of his product, capital. This is, again, this notion which may seem paradoxical to you, but Marx is dealing with a capitalist system which, even in its so-called highest achieving progress, even when the New York Times sends out the email about how capitalism is somehow restored its unemployment and GDP is up and all of these things, even all of these metrics of the bourgeois specialists say are hitting their targets and their marks. Marx is saying that this is not that actually is only further eviscerating the experience of the workers' relationship to their own labor. Okay. He goes on page 72 to talk about, again, bringing back this metaphor of the way that this world becomes comparable to religion. Okay. And it's here where Marx puts forward a theory of religion as alienation. Okay. On the top of 72. The more man puts into God, the less he retains in himself. The worker puts his life into the object, but now his life no longer belongs to him. So it's a kind of theory of an energy dispensation system, right? Where it's a zero-sum game of deprivation, right? In which nothing is left in the exchange. And then the exchange with the religious example is interesting because, in a way, I'd like to know what people think about that. In a sense, this is not Marx of the opium of religion as opium of the masses. This is a more insidious form of almost like spiritual robbery, right? I mean, this is Marx at his most at his biggest assault on Christianity, perhaps. But I wonder what Cave thinks.
Yeah, actually, I had a question about the this concept of object bondage. I mean, it's a little bit I lost there. I'm not quite sure what it means. I mean, maybe people can parse it out. Yeah, just a question.
Well, Daniel, you're muted.
Sorry, guys. I understand that as twofold, right? So it's loss of reality. Okay, loss of reality. while at the same time physical bondage, because Marx is invoking in a moment the physical reduction of the worker to an animal, to the status of basically an animal. So therefore, that's what he means by bondage as I read it. It's a physical form. It's a physical form that also affects his consciousness. That's the reality. So it's consciousness. That's how I would juxtapose it, those two.
So in a sense, it's kind of consumerism too, right? Like, because they are, I mean, to sustain themselves as labor, right? I mean, is it something like that? Like, they're producing this commodity, of course, but they also rely to this strange, alienated form of labor in the form of commodity. Yeah,
Yeah, he's going to break down that distinction in a moment, which we'll get to in a moment, between the estrangement of the thing and the what he calls self-estrangement. So estrangement of the thing is the product of labor as an alien object that exerts power over the worker. The other form of alienation is what he calls self-estrangement, which happens in the act of production with the labor process itself. Okay, that's the important distinction that Marx will develop. This is the relation of the worker's own activity as an alien activity. So he says estrangement of the thing and then self-estrangement. Estrangement of the thing is through the product of labor as an alien object that exerts power over him. Okay. So I think that's our distinction that he's trying to, you see, because Marx has this circular way of argumentation where he'll introduce something that he later will develop more. Like he'll introduce this polarity, which later is developed, I feel like. Tara, please.
So I find the kind of movement between the sort of religion and analogy, because you're sort of positing it as he's developing a theory of religion. I mean, and again, this is where I'm really shaky, so forgive me, but isn't Hegel, like, doesn't he just do a whole reading of religion that lands in Christianity because it becomes like the embodied God, right? In Jesus Christ, or right? Am I wrong about this? At an earlier time, there was something very productive. I find this analogy incredibly productive.
Well, I think the point would be here is
Yeah.
that the loss of the inner world of the worker, the experiential loss, okay, of this particular form of estrangement, these various forms of estrangement, okay, he says on page 72, okay, the more powerful the alien objective world becomes, which he creates over against himself, the poorer is he himself. His inner world becomes. So you see, the success of capital has an inverse relationship to the degradation of the possible realization of the man as a religious being.
Okay.
In a simple sense.
Right.
So but then he's also saying, I think, that for the worker to go to church on a daily basis, that they would also reproduce a certain relationship to that process, if it is at all transposable to the way that they experience factory life and working life. It's a non-realizable form of religion and spirituality,
Right.
is what I'm trying to say.
I want
Please.
to add to that, because then it makes me think of what Zizek says in For They Know Not What They Do about how Protestantism, and of course he's talking about the vanishing mediator in Max Weber and via Frederick Jameson, about how like in that sense, Protestantism was like the gateway to capitalism, where it's like, yes, they were religious, but not because like they were in the sort of ascetic sense of like proto Protestantism, the Catholicism and its sort of mystical ways, that you didn't have to renunciate yourself. You just had to like continuously work hard and work hard at work and then come to church. And then that was like your ability to continue to keep fulfilling yourself and your civic duties, for lack of a better term. So it's like religion also takes on an inverted form for Zizek. And I know you have like
Yeah,
an affiliation with Zizek as well, and his
yeah.
Marxism,
I mean, you could think of the socialist, like the reformist socialist Christian, right? Who says, yeah, the worker has objectification through alienated labor, but they use the church to come in touch with some resolution or some healing of that process. And maybe, if they work at it hard enough, they can overcome that and make a peace with that horror. But Marx on 72 is much more resolute about this. He says, quote, the alienation of the worker in his product means not only that his labor becomes an object in external existence, but that it exists outside him, independently, as something alien to him, and that it becomes a power on its own confronting him. It means that the life which he has conferred on the object confronts him as something hostile and alien. Okay, in philosophy, there is a branch of continental philosophy called alterity, which refers to different theories of otherness in phenomenology. Okay, this is the site where Marx develops a theory of alterity, a theory of otherness. Okay, in an abstract way. We will see later how this can be concretized. Okay, and how, in a Marxist point of view, that congealed alien object actually can be transposed back into a logic of, like, you can actually take that phenomenology and fit it into a sociology in some sense. That again goes to the interdisciplinarity of this text, because in a moment Marx will make a claim about anthropology, right? So we have philosophy, we have anthropology, we have sociology, we have phenomenology, we have political economy, all in dialogue with, we have theology, all in dialogue with each other. It's no surprise that Marx had no place in the academy. You're not allowed to do that, right? But let us look now more closely at the objectification, at the production of the worker, and therein at the estrangement, the loss of the object of his product. Because remember, it's producing a loss as well as keeping a bondage of him. It's like a loss and it's external to him, while at the same time that condition is kept constant. So it's a totally radical meta critique on freedom and the lack thereof, right? The worker can create nothing without nature. Now Marx is getting into a positive vision of what objectification actually is, right? Beyond this degraded form, okay? The worker can create nothing without nature, without the sensuous external world. It is the material on which his labor is manifested, in which it is active, from which and by means of which it produces. But just as nature provides labor with the means of life, in the sense that labor cannot live without objects on which to operate, on the other hand, it also produces the means of life in the more restricted sense, in essence, the means for the physical subsistence of the worker himself. Thus, the more the worker by his labor appropriates the external world, sensuous nature, the more he deprives himself of means of life in the double respect. First, that the sensuous external world more and more ceases to be an object belonging to his labor, to his means of life. And second, that it more and more ceases to be means of life in the immediate sense, means for the physical subsistence of the worker. So in that sense, the worker is basically a slave to the object of labor and a slave to the means of subsistence, which enables him to exist in the first place. And these two are interrelated. That, I think, Kaveh, is the double point that you had a question about before. You can't call the game off one day and say, I don't want to go to work today. I mean, you can, but you'll be punished. On one hand. On the other hand, unless you have access to the means of production, you can't magically become an entrepreneur and enter into some free-floating leisurely life. So this is absolutely a condition which we still live with, right? And so Marx, I think it's very close, by the way, to a concept of fetishism on page 73. If you go down to the paragraph which starts with political economy, he says, quote, political economy conceals the estrangement inherent in the nature of labor by not considering the direct relationship between the worker, labor, and production. That actually goes back to Kent's point, I think, earlier. That's both the unthought point, but also like the launching point for where Marx wants to take political economy, by the way. Okay. And then he has a bracket before that where he says the laws of political economy express the estrangement of the worker in his object. Okay. So again, he reiterates that point we've mentioned several times now, which is that political economy already kind of identifies these laws, but they haven't taken it far enough. Okay. I was thinking that it would be useful at this point to flag, and for folks who want to take notes, if you're taking notes, Mészáros, in his famous book on Marxist theory of alienation, reminds us that there are 4 forms of alienation in this text. So let's just throw them on the table right now, and then we'll go back to our close reading. I thought this might be helpful just for folks to jot down. 1, man is alienated from nature. 2, alienated from himself in his own activity. 3, man is also alienated from what Marx called his species being, or from a proper connection to the human species. And then finally, 4, man is alienated from man. Man is alienated from others in an interpersonal way. Okay. But Marx then will shift gears slightly and ask an interesting question, which is, but why is alienated labor itself alienated? Like he's like, let's dig into this alienation even further to find out what the hell is going on here. And that's what we get here on 74, 75 through 76. Okay. Is basically a deeper immersion into these various forms of alienated labor. So we can walk through these unless there's any comments or questions. Because we are at 8:10. I think so. I can walk through these 3 pages and we can close in like 20 minutes. I think somebody wrote these 4 in the chat. Thank you for doing that. Don't get object bondage. That's funny.
Yeah, Daniel, I guess I have some comments concerning the 4 elements of alienation.
Yes.
So before, because obviously for Marx, it's like labor, for lack of a better term, is constitutive to man as species being, that he recognizes himself within his activity. I think he says that even further in German Ideology, the Critique of
Yeah.
Foreign Thought. But has alienation for him always existed with this notion of labor, just in different forms? And the reason why I ask that is because I obviously, I come from the more Lacanian, Zizekian stance where it's like subjectivity is constitutive, but I've always heard from like someone like Fleecefader or Todd McGowan that like Marx is naive because he thinks alienation will end after socialism, but I don't really think like that naive. My question is alienation present in species being even before
Yeah.
objectification and estrangement of labor? You just see it
I want to say first of all, Marx isn't interested in that question right now. That will become a question. Um, but no, I mean, put another way, is the theory of that Marx puts forward insofar as the kind of prescriptive suggestion for a form of non-alienated labor, which he does suggest in the pages we're about to look at. He does suggest that. Is even that form riddled with certain forms of alienation? Of course. I mean, there's room for that. But you're asking that after Stalinism, right? You're asking that in the wake of 1917.
Right.
Marx didn't have the luxury to know the direction by which anti-capitalist struggles, let's say, would go, right? So in that sense, Marx is dealing with a society in which only, well, first of all, in which forms of chattel slavery still exist around the world. It's a society in which only 15 to 20% of men even have the right to vote. It's a society in which if you're not a property owner, right, you are reduced to animal labor. What does that mean? That means that your life expectancy is extremely low. So it's a misceration thesis all the way down for the worker. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. Like, it's not on the itinerary yet. I can see why it would be for us. Go ahead, Kaveh.
Yeah, just to this point about the alienation, I think something I actually helpful in Marx, and I like that. At least to some extent that I understand Marx, his concept of alienation is contingent, historically contingent, rather than primordial Hegelian or primordial existentialist way of thinking alienation. And that's, I think, a value in Kant. I mean, it doesn't, I mean, I would say it doesn't amount that, after communism, there is not alienation, but there won't definitely alienation in this capitalist sense, right? At least what I understand from Marx, and that's a value. It's very much useful than like existentialism way of thinking about alienation, which is kind of primordial in this sense, human condition.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I think once we go through, Andrew, flag that question, and then we can look back, because what Marx is talking about is a certain form of liberation from this particular nexus of estranged labor. Okay. So what you're asking is a slightly different question, but Luis, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that what's great about Marx is that he's able to just shows everything as like a organic whole rather than like divide things up. Which is why he's able to talk about like religion and then economics and then sociology all in the same breath. I guess one question it may be a bit off topic, So you know what? Never mind. Yeah.
Well, throw it out there, and then we can revisit it. Just go ahead and throw it out there.
So it's basically about what you. I think I asked this like last session, and it was about like the topic of alienation, and what does that do? How does that change like the practical organizing? And then I think you mentioned about like you gave us the example the 1956 Hungarian Revolution,
Mm-hmm.
and you know I looked it up a little bit. I'm still don't understand because I barely have like a reference to that, honestly. Outside of like starting to
Yeah.
study like Lukács a
Yeah,
little.
I think what we're gonna do is, by the way, guys, I've already sent out an email to a couple specialists in alienation and Marx to invite them to give a talk to our group when we're done. And so we can do that, but also, Luis, we can also examine some of these more, contemporary questions, or like these historical questions like Hungarian Revolution and study that further. But let's just stick to the text for now. And so that will be on February 6th. Cave, I did invite Musto, Marcello Musto, the author of Marx's writings on alienation. He's not able to come, but he's very interested to do something with us in the future, by the way. So we will hopefully do that. And I have started his book on alienation, by the way, Cave. So let's hold it like that if we can, Luis. Um, um, Tariq, my friend, let's go, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to put one more thing on the table before you were getting into you were talking about the different academic or disciplinary registers that Marx is working in, and you mentioned phenomenology as being one of them, particularly developing a phenomenology of alterity. I think another thing to keep in mind, especially once we're getting into the different forms of alienation, I think what we're also seeing is a kind of embodiment phenomenology. We're really getting a description on, particularly what the body, like how the worker experiences his body, particularly in work. And, this is something that I think has been explored a bit more, particularly in the writings of like Soren Mao. And so just putting that kind of out there in terms of like some of the other things that I think Marx is kind of developing in the background.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it's really helpful. And in a sense, the question on the body in relationship to what Marx kind of calls the human animal, um, becomes a such a strong point of distinction that you almost then have to think about Marx vis-a-vis Aristotle and vis-a-vis this rational Enlightenment tradition of even Kant, and what the preconditions in like Kant's what is Enlightenment of breaking from animal forms of bondage, etc., because Marx is using these forms, and so this is something we need to flag at the level of the physical, um because there is also a kind of homage to a form of liberated physical being that is here in the text that also appears that we should be attentive to, because we're now in the deep end, as it were. So on page 75, he says, the worker experiences two forms of estrangement. The first is estrangement of the thing, and this relation is the relation of the worker to his own activity as an alien activity not belonging to him. Because the worker is alienated and their labor is external to them, his labor is not voluntary, but it is coerced. This is also a relation to the external sensuous world, as we said. And then importantly on 75, and this is, I think, a very big one, by the way, he says, quote, the worker is an animal in civil society due to this dependence, quote, in the abstraction that separates them from the sphere of all other human activity and turns them into sole and ultimate ends. They are animal. 75. The life of the species, both in man and in animals, consists physically in the fact that man, like the animal, lives on inorganic nature. And the more universal man is compared with an animal, the more universal is the sphere of inorganic nature on which he lives. And so he develops this really kind of insane theory of organic versus inorganic nature and how man is distinct from the animal kingdom in relationship. And what is the answer? I mean, ultimately, the answer is that um, it's an answer almost that man is capable of creating superfluous forms of inorganic nature that do not that exceed mere need, right? That transcend that, and that, in a sense, and here's a big claim I want to make and see if you agree, even where Marx and Nietzsche would absolutely be in dialogue with each other. Okay, what distinguishes man here for Marx is something about the production of culture. Okay, and there is therefore a claim about what is most unique about man is even something, well, perhaps aesthetic, is what I'm getting from these pages, by the way. But that's sort of a big claim, and we can go back and uh, we can go back to it. Let me try to point out what I mean by this. Okay. In estranging man from man, one, nature, and two, himself, his own active functions, his life activity, estranged labor estranges the species from man. It turns for him the life of the species into a means of individual life. First, it estranges the life of the species in individual life, and secondly, it makes individual life in its abstract form the purpose of the life of the species. So it subordinates the category of this, it sort of contaminates the category of species being in a way which subordinates everything to the logic of capital, right? And then there's a double relationship at work in which man actually comes to see his own freedom only through that prism. So there is a sort of a philosophical catastrophe on our hands in terms of understanding man that capitalism is reaping here. Yet the productive life is the life of the species. It is life engendering life. It is life engendering life. The whole character of a species, its species character, is contained in the character of its life activity, and free conscious activity is man's species character. Life itself appears only as a means to life. The animal is immediately identical with its life activity. It does not distinguish itself from it. It is its life activity. And then he says, man makes his life activity itself the object of his will and of his consciousness. He has conscious life activity. It is not a determination with which he directly merges. So he's getting at this point that it is just because of this that he is a species being, or it is only because he is a species being that he is a conscious being, that his own life is an object for him. Only because of that is his activity free activity. So that's what estranged labor is not, okay? But what estranged labor is a reversal of that, he says. It is just because man is a conscious being that he makes his life activity his essential being, a mere means to his existence. So therefore, life affirming life is a form of freedom that is capable of affirming a mode of existence which is not subordinated to these various forms of object dependence and so on. It's like, I don't know how you guys read this, and I want you guys to jump in, but it's like, I guess you could say it's a different theory of objectification. It's a theory of objectification which is not reliant on the subordination of all activity to estranged labor. And this is This is like exactly what is not possible for the worker. But it's not only not possible for the worker, because Marx says that that alterity that the worker has of estrangement is shared. There's not, it's not that the other class, the property owning class or the bourgeois class, is immune from it. They just experience it differently, but they too are not capable of entering into the type of affirmative life activity, productive of life. So it's not available in capitalist society. So I feel like 76 through 77 is the beginning of Marx really laying out something utopian. Something utopian. I'm not afraid to use that term. I don't know how others feel about the use of that term in this instance when you're reading it, but
I
why
mean,
not?
I think it's worth dwelling on the animal man distinction, particularly to kind of draw out what he's saying is like in animal labor, the animal, builds and produces things that are consistent with, prolonging its life activity and prolonging its own particular life. Whereas the conscious life activity of the human being has the capacity, as you were saying, to produce something that is beyond just mere life. He has the capacity to build culture, has the capacity to build art, has the capacity to produce laws that live on after one's life. And under a capitalist system, that relationship is reversed such that the worker is no longer in a position where what they work and produce is a matter of producing, say, art or culture, but they work to produce a wage that inevitably prolongs their life. And I think that's kind of how he makes sense of some of the things he's saying. I think it's a little bit earlier or a little later when he says about, the worker feels at home when he's procreating, eating, sleeping, doing all the things that animals do, and not at home, in this kind of utopian sense, not at home
Yes.
finding a world that is beyond that of life.
Yes. He says, okay, so if the worker appears in civil society as an animal, what that also means is a cultural claim, because the animal only produces one-sidedly, Marx says on 77. It produces one-sidedly while man produces universally. But again, the worker is not man in this instance. So when man comes to civil society, he has no culture in some sense. That's a very profound point. And that actually leads to this claim that Marxism should be about allowing workers to build culture. By the way, that's a separate point, but nonetheless related. But he says, yeah, an animal produces only itself, while man reproduces the whole of nature, he says. An animal's product belongs immediately to its physical body, while man freely confronts his product. An animal forms things in accordance with the standard and the need of the species to which it belongs, while man knows how to produce in accordance with the standard of every species and knows how to apply everywhere the inherent standard to the object. Man, therefore, also forms things in accordance with the laws of beauty. That's what I was looking for, apropos aesthetics. That's a huge one that should be underlined for anybody that wants to, make that claim about Marx. Page 77, you can quote that with beauty. I think that's quite nice. Please, Aaron.
Yeah, two things. The first is I'm a little skeptical about the sense in which this is a phenomenology, or at least in the sense that we're using it here in the emphasis on experience, right? I feel like alienation is in some sense an objective. It's a social relation, right? And it doesn't depend on the experience of the subjects who are alienated. Uh, it's not a psychological concept. It's a concept of an objective social relation that does depend on subjective states like mutual recognition of social norms, but is in some sense objective, right? And I guess I wanted to press a little on what sense this is. I guess it's phenomenological in that it's about the experience of these social dynamics in history. but it's not phenomenological in a Husserlian or like 20th century sense, I think.
True. When I use the word phenomenology, I just meant that it's working in the Hegelian register
Mhm.
um, of objectification. So the category of objectification I see stemming from the philosophical school of phenomenology. Now, I agree that my use of the word experience is probably misplaced in this instance, because that category of experience means something quite specific within phenomenology. So I take your
Mhm.
point at that level,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. But I also see your point, and I think you're actually correct. But later we will see that Marx will put finer points on applying how these particular forms of alienated social life fit within the class matrices of capitalism. And I think
Mhm.
at that point, right, when Marx starts talking about the contrast between property and propertyless standpoints of alienated labor, you get more specific, you know. But I think your point's well taken.
Mhm. Yeah, and I
Did you?
guess the
Yeah,
second,
go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, then the second thing was to answer your question about alienation from species being and um, sort of the character of humanity here. And I think the right way to approach this is um, maybe it's more boring or more traditional, but it's the Hegelian or the Aristotelian answer, and that's reason, right? That like I think the category of reason is really central here, and that what's meant by free conscious activity is rational activity, and what is being given up in a capitalist market economy is really rational, like purposiveness itself in some way, and in a way that's specific to a capitalist market economy. That even in sort of medieval Europe, you could build a cathedral for the sake of building a beautiful cathedral, whereas in a world mediated by capitalist market forces, all construction has to be done under conditions of competition and necessity, trying to get to the most profit extraction, trying to get the lowest common denominator of like sort of output per product on building materials and things. You don't build a home for the sake of building a beautiful home. You build it as an investment, right? And in this way, both the worker and the capitalist is estranged from the purpose of their own activity in what they do, right? Whether they're doing it from any side, we're estranged from practical reason itself in a certain way that's specific to capitalism. Um, right? Does that make sense?
Yep. It
I
makes a
think,
lot of sense. Yeah, it makes a
and
lot
I
of
think that
sense, and we'll
answers that
see.
earlier question
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
about whether
mm-hmm,
I think this kind of alienation is supposed to disappear under communism, whether other
mm-hmm,
forms persist, right? It's this specific
mm-hmm.
social relation that alienates us from doing things for reasons, right?
Yeah, yeah. Let's keep attention to how Marx invokes reason in these manuscripts. Thank you for that intervention. I mean, I completely agree with you on really on both points. Um, Matilda, please. You are muted.
Yeah, thank you for that point, Aaron. I really appreciated that. Um, yeah, there's just so much in here. I'm kind of losing whatever. There's so many strains like swimming through my head, but I think that that I think Marx thinks like labor should be an end in itself, and that like there's some relationship to like building up the material of nature, and that there is something utopian here. It almost turns in this piece almost turns into like a science fiction piece to me, because there's something about like if all of the objects in the world are objects of labor, you now have this world that is like full of human objectification of objectification, and I am losing my strain of thought, but thank you for everyone.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much. Tariq, please.
Yeah, no, I wanted to comment on the phenomenology point, particularly thinking. I think it might be important. Like, yeah, on the one hand, Marx is not prefiguring a kind of like 20th century movement that will, become phenomenology. He's kind of rooted in this kind of Hegelian frame. But I think one thing to kind of keep in mind is that second thing that estranged labor is estranging, which is estrangement from oneself, particularly how the worker experiences himself. And I think in that way, it's not too distant from some concepts that we'll see emerge in phenomenology, like the inauthenticity of Dasein or bad faith in Sartre. In fact, I think Sartre is a really interesting case because he uses the example of the cafe waiter worker as a kind of really powerful example of kind of how we see bad faith working out in a workplace environment.
Aaron, do you want to jump in on that? Or
Totally. No, Tyreek, I think you're right. I think that's the right way to read Uneinigkeit or inauthenticity is in the same way as being unable to take rational responsibility for what's at stake in the process, right? I think that's not the way most people read Heidegger or an authenticity, but I think that's the right way to do it.
Let's go to Tony.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Aaron was saying. I think the point about the subjective experience of the worker, I mean, it's not like Marx never says anything about that. There's that, I didn't find it, but there's this one paragraph where he's like, at home he feels, at work he doesn't feel at home. At home he doesn't, and he does these sort of descriptions of opposites. But I think one thing that comes, like, one thing I noticed in the text was the word objective just appears constantly. It will be interesting to count. And the word subjective, or like experiential words like feel and experience and subject are, yeah, very rare. Like, I only found that one paragraph. So I think that the point is there in like a concrete linguistic analysis that Marx is talking about objective social relations. And it's not like that doesn't have impacts on your subjective experience, but I think like ideology also plays a really important role. Like, if you talk to my mom, she's like, oh, work is great. I feel so fulfilled. But yeah, she's not lying. Like, she does feel that way. And so I think that the part where Marx is talking about how shitty the workers' lives are, I think he's just like describing Manchester in like 1850. Like, I don't think it's a universal point about that subjective experience. And the other analysis about objective social relations, I think, is very much more universal and still true today. So yeah, love what Aaron had to say. All right, that's it.
Thank you very much. We're going to close soon. I want to respect everybody's evening. Let's go to Kaveh next, please.
Yeah, I want to just, shortly come back to your point, Daniel, about the production of culture. I mean, these 2 pages are super interesting. It seems to me, I mean, Marx has some sort of aesthetic theory, and also along the line and between the line, I'm reading like the theories in artistry and art aesthetics, for example, about avant-gardism and so forth. which is pretty interesting. Like I definitely
Right.
probably Marx look at like Saint-Simonian avant-gardism, which is very much limited to some sense. But I was comparing Marx when I was reading this against the backdrop of some of the theories in art history. I don't know if people are familiar with Greenberg, Clement Greenberg. I was thinking about his theory about avant-garde, and it's very interesting that Greenberg was thinking in the passage that he was writing that yeah, we are right now in the alienated world, but we need the culture, right? We need culture moving. So he has this famous quote about avant-gardism to find this path along which it would be possible to keep culture moving in the midst of ideological confusion, which conditioned by
Yeah.
alienation. I mean, it's yeah, it just strikes me. Anyhow.
That's very helpful. I mean, I think that Tony's point that even though Marx is dealing with a system of capitalism where he's basically submitting to a kind of immiseration thesis of the condition of the working class, it's exactly like what Engels is writing about in the condition of the working class in England, for example. That doesn't take away from the timeless application of what he's saying here at the same time, because capitalism still subordinates and alienates man from his species life. Because even if the spectrum of the degradation of the physical demands of capitalist labor are more onerous then than they may be now, that still doesn't take away from the possibility, or rather from the fact that man is still robbed from access to a particular form of species life. And I'll just read a quote to elucidate this on page 77. This, I think, will help us and we can conclude on this. Okay, he says, the second paragraph there. It is just in the working up of the objective world, therefore, that man first really proves himself to be a species being. This production is his active species life. Through and because of this production, nature appears as his work and his reality. The object of his labor is, therefore, the objectification of man's species life. For he duplicates himself not only as in consciousness, intellectually, but also actively, in reality, and therefore he contemplates himself in a world that he has created. That's the alienation of man to man, because that contemplation is not possible for a vast majority of workers. And then if you say further that, well, we've lifted the welfare of those workers, so now they can participate as full citizens in civil society, that would be the great haunting specter of Marx returning and returning again to claim that that liberation has not been adequate. Yeah. Uh, uh, in tearing away from man the object of his production, therefore, estranged labor tears from him his species life, his real species objectivity, and transforms his advantage over animals into the disadvantage that his inorganic body, nature, is taken from him. So it's not only done that, but then he goes on to say that it's also taken man's species life away at the level of his physical existence as well, right? So I think we should pause here. And by the way, on 78, there's a wonderful footnote to the concept of objectification in the Essence of Christianity by Feuerbach, which you can read a long quote from, to understand how significant objectification is for Marx in this text. It's related back to Feuerbach. Okay. So that might actually be a useful thing to read on for next time. But since I promised we would close at 8:30 and we're 15 minutes past, let's break. And let's plan to read, just for folks to know, you can make a note of it now. We didn't get as far as I wanted, but let's go from 77 to about 125, 130, if it's possible. We'll try to work through that, so that we can finish the next time after that on the 30th. The text concludes at 168. Does that sound all right? Fabulous discussion, everybody. And reach out with any further concerns or questions? Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
Peace out, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, Daniel.
See you. Bye.